The Galactic Council chamber floated in the void of space like a giant crystal bubble, catching the light from distant stars and throwing it back in rainbow patterns across its curved walls. Inside, representatives from 700 different species sat in their designated seats, some breathing oxygen, others methane, some floating in tanks of liquid ammonia. They had gathered here for 12,000 years, making decisions that shaped the fate of entire civilizations, and today they were discussing a problem that most of them considered barely worth their time. Ambassador Velcros stood at the speaking platform, his insect-like body covered in blue-green chitin that clicked and clattered as he moved. He was nervous, though he tried to hide it behind the formal gestures required by Council protocol. The report he carried contained data that should have alarmed every being in the chamber, but he could already see the bored expressions on many faces, the way some representatives were checking their personal devices instead of paying attention. The humans were expanding too fast, Velcros explained, his translator turning his clicking sounds into words that echoed through the chamber. In just 30 years since making first contact with the galactic community, these newcomers from a small yellow star had established colonies on 17 worlds. They were building factories, farms, and cities at a pace that seemed almost frantic. More concerning was their military buildup, the way they insisted on keeping armed ships around every single settlement, even the small ones with just a few thousand people. Counselor Jara drifted forward in her water tank, her jellyfish body pulsing with colors that indicated dismissal and amusement. She had reviewed the human files personally and found nothing impressive about them. They had barely figured out how to travel faster than light, using crude engines that other species had abandoned millennia ago. Their weapons were projectile-based, throwing chunks of metal at high speeds like primitive catapults. Compared to the plasma weapons and quantum disruptors that proper civilizations wielded, human armaments were laughable. High Chancellor Morazan raised one clawed hand, silencing the scattered conversations that had broken out among the council members. He was old even by the standards of his long-lived species. His scales dulled to a gray-brown color, his eyes filmed with age but still sharp with intelligence. He had personally met the human ambassador during their admission ceremony 3 decades ago, and had been unimpressed. They were soft creatures, easily damaged with short lifespans that barely allowed them to accumulate wisdom. They spoke constantly of honor and freedom, 2 concepts that Morazan considered obstacles to efficient governance. The vote proceeded with mechanical precision, each council member registering their decision through neural interfaces that tallied the results instantly. The outcome was never in doubt. By a margin of 532 to 168, the council decided to take no direct action regarding human expansion. Instead, they would implement trade restrictions designed to slow the humans down, to teach them that growth in the galactic community required patience and respect for established hierarchies. Some species needed to learn humility before they could be trusted with real responsibility. Velcros returned to his seat, his antennae drooping with frustration. He had spent months compiling that report, traveling to human colonies, observing their behavior, studying their history. What he had seen there troubled him deeply. These were not the soft, easily controlled creatures that the council believed them to be. They had survived and thrived on a death world, a planet with extreme weather, aggressive predators, and diseases that would kill most galactic species within hours. They had clawed their way up from primitive tool users to spacefaring civilization in an impossibly short time, and they had done it while fighting each other in wars that made council conflicts look like polite disagreements. But most troubling of all was something Velcros had seen in the eyes of the human diplomats he had met. It was not fear or submission or even anger. It was patience. The kind of cold, calculating patience that a predator shows while watching its prey, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. He had tried to convey this in his report, but words on a screen could not capture the chill that ran through his nervous system when a human smiled and assured him that everything would work out fine. On Earth, in the sprawling underground complex that housed the Terran Defense Initiative headquarters, Admiral Jacob Price stood by the massive windows that looked out over the Swiss Alps. Snow covered the peaks in white blankets, pristine and beautiful, reminding him of simpler times before humanity had reached the stars. He was 58 years old, with gray hair cut military short and eyes that had seen too many battlefields. The message from the Galactic Council glowed on the screen behind him, its diplomatic language barely concealing the contempt beneath. Commander Lisa Hayes stood beside him, her tablet displaying the full text of the Council's decision, along with analysis from the Intelligence Division. She was 32, brilliant and absolutely furious. The restrictions they were proposing would strangle human colonies, cutting off supplies of rare elements needed for terraforming, blocking trade routes that settlers depended on for medicine and equipment. It was economic warfare dressed up as policy, and everyone knew it. Jacob had expected this outcome, had even planned for it, but seeing it written out in official council language still made his blood run cold. He had fought in the colony wars 20 years ago, back when different human factions were still killing each other over resources and ideology. He had seen what happened when people were pushed too far, when they had nothing left to lose except their dignity. The council thought they understood humanity because they had observed them for 30 years of peaceful cooperation. But 30 years was nothing compared to 10,000 years of human history written in blood and fire. He turned away from the window and walked to the strategic display that dominated the center of the command room. Holographic markers showed every human colony, every fleet position, every potential choke point in space where conflict might erupt. His staff officers stood around the display waiting for orders, their faces reflecting the same grim determination that Jacob felt in his chest. The council had made their decision, Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room despite its low volume. They had chosen to see humanity as children who needed discipline, as primitives who needed to be taught their place. They had ignored every warning, every attempt at reasonable discussion, every effort to find a peaceful solution. They thought that because humans had been cooperative for 3 decades, that cooperation would continue no matter what pressures were applied. They were about to learn how badly they had miscalculated. The attack began at precisely 0400 Galactic Standard Time, synchronized across 14 star systems with a precision that would have been impossible without months of careful planning. Human forces had spent weeks positioning themselves in empty space, using the new phase shift technology that allowed ships to become temporarily undetectable to conventional sensors. The Council's military commanders, comfortable in their assumptions about human technological inferiority, had no idea that enemy fleets were already inside their defensive perimeters, waiting for the signal to strike. In the Thaxian home system, the massive orbital shipyards that had been constructing the invasion fleet became the first target. Commander Greg Sullivan, promoted to colonel after his defense of Kepler 442b, led a squadron of 30 strike craft that materialized from phase shift less than 1,000 kilometers from the shipyards. The Thaxian defense satellites, configured to detect incoming ships from standard approach vectors, did not even register the threat until human missiles were already tearing through the shipyard superstructure. The explosions lit up the night sky of the Thaxian homeworld, visible from the surface as a chain of bright flares that grew and merged into a sustained glow. Greg watched through his cockpit displays as 7 years of shipyard construction vanished in 15 minutes of sustained bombardment. He felt no satisfaction in the destruction, only a grim awareness that this was necessary, that the ships being destroyed here would have been used to attack human colonies within months. At Station Harmony, the crystalline structure that had housed the Galactic Council for 12,000 years, chaos erupted as alarms blared through every corridor. Colonel Greg's Marines, having infiltrated the station days earlier disguised as maintenance workers, simultaneously seized control of the power generation systems and communications arrays. They had studied the station layouts for months, identifying critical systems and security weaknesses, preparing for an operation that everyone knew was suicide, but that had to be attempted anyway. The council chamber itself descended into panic as the lights flickered and emergency systems activated. High Chancellor Morazan demanded explanations from his security forces, his reptilian features twisted with an emotion that none of the other council members had ever seen on his face before. Genuine fear. Councillor Jara's environmental tank began emergency procedures, draining to minimum levels and forcing her to retreat into a specialized survival suit that she had never needed to use in all her years of service. Ambassador Velcros remained in his seat, mandibles clicking in a pattern that might have been grim satisfaction. He had warned them that humans were dangerous when cornered, that they would not simply accept subjugation, that the Council's policy of harassment would lead to exactly this outcome. No one had listened to him then, and now the price of that arrogance was being paid in blood and fire across Council space. Captain Henry Wade commanded the space battle around Station Harmony from the bridge of the battlecruiser Defiance. His fleet consisted of 30 ships facing down more than 200 Council vessels that were scrambling to respond to the unexpected attack. The numbers should have meant certain death for the human forces, but the battle did not follow any pattern that Council military doctrine had prepared for. Human ships used their phase shift capability to appear, launch devastating attacks, and vanish again before return fire could find them. They coordinated with a precision that suggested every captain knew exactly where every other ship would be at every moment. They exploited weaknesses in Council formations that the defenders did not even know existed, targeting command ships first to create confusion, then systematically destroying weapons platforms and shield generators. The Defiance itself became the center of a deadly dance, drawing enemy fire while smaller destroyers and frigates materialized at unexpected angles to hit the distracted Council ships. Henry had studied every major space battle in recorded history, both human and alien, looking for patterns and principles that transcended species and technology. What he had learned was simple. Battles were won not by superior numbers but by superior coordination and willingness to take risks. On the surface of Serpentis Prime, the homeworld of the reptilian species that had dominated Council military forces for millennia, General Victor Hayes led 3,000 Marines in an assault on the Imperial Palace. They had inserted via high-altitude drop pods that scattered them across the capital city, then converged on the palace through multiple approach routes that overwhelmed the defenders' ability to coordinate a response. The Serpentis warriors were formidable opponents, trained from childhood in combat arts that emphasized honor and formal battle tactics. But they had never faced an enemy that ignored those rules, that used buildings as cover and civilians as camouflage, that struck from unexpected directions and retreated before counterattacks could be organized. Victor's Marines moved through the palace complex with brutal efficiency, bypassing strong points and isolating defensive positions, achieving in hours what a conventional assault would have taken weeks. Director Claire Bennett coordinated the information warfare campaign from her office in Geneva, her team simultaneously broadcasting across every communication channel in galactic space. The civilian populations of Council worlds, who had been told that humans were violent aggressors preparing to attack peaceful civilizations, suddenly received a very different story. Footage of the Thaxian invasion of Kepler 442b, carefully edited to show the unprovoked bombardment of civilian structures, recordings of trade convoy detentions with timestamps proving systematic harassment, intercepted communications between Council military commanders discussing plans to partition human territory. The impact of this information release was devastating to Council morale. Civilian populations across dozens of worlds began questioning their governments, demanding explanations for why they were preparing for war against a species that had only been defending itself. Protests erupted on Council homeworlds. Several species that had been minor members of the Council coalition quietly withdrew their military forces, declaring neutrality and refusing to participate in what they now recognized as an unjust conflict. The battle raged for 18 hours across Council space. Human casualties, carefully tracked by field commanders, numbered fewer than 1,000 dead. Council losses were estimated at over 300,000, though exact figures would take months to compile. But the real damage was not measured in ships destroyed or soldiers killed. The real damage was to something far more precious to the Council, their sense of invincibility. For 12,000 years, the Council had been the supreme authority in the galaxy, their decisions final and their power unchallengeable. Individual species might resist, might fight small skirmishes over territorial disputes, but no one had ever launched a coordinated assault on the Council itself. The idea had been unthinkable, impossible beyond consideration. Now that impossibility had become reality, and the psychological impact rippled through Council space like a shockwave. Admiral Jacob Price arrived at Station Harmony 8 hours after the fighting ended, his shuttle docking at a bay that Marines had secured and cleared of debris. He walked through corridors lined with Surrender Council security forces, stepping over damaged equipment and scorch marks from weapons fire until he reached the Council chamber itself. The great crystal dome was cracked in several places, emergency patches holding back the vacuum of space, But the chamber was still functional. The representatives of 700 species watched in stunned silence as Jacob walked to the speaking platform, his boots echoing on the floor in a room designed for perfect acoustics. He wore his dress uniform, medals from a career of service to humanity displayed on his chest, but he carried no weapons and brought no guards. He stood alone before the assembled power of galactic civilization and spoke in a voice that was calm, measured, and absolutely certain. Humanity had not wanted this war, he told them. Humanity had sought peaceful coexistence, had followed council laws, had tried every diplomatic avenue to resolve disputes, but the council had responded to human cooperation with contempt, had mistaken patience for weakness, had believed that economic pressure and military threats would force submission. They had ignored every warning, dismissed every attempt at negotiation, and pushed humanity into a corner where violence became the only remaining option. The sanctions would end immediately, Jacob continued. Human sovereignty would be recognized and respected. Any future aggression against human territory would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. The council could accept these terms and work toward genuine peace, or they could refuse and watch their civilization burn around them. The choice, he said quietly, was theirs. The peace negotiations took place in neutral space 3 months after the attacks, aboard a newly constructed station that would eventually serve as the permanent diplomatic center for human council relations. The station was deliberately designed without the grandeur of station harmony, without the crystalline beauty that had symbolized council superiority for 12 millennia. Instead, it was functional and modest, built from standardized modules that could have come from either human or alien shipyards. The symbolism was clear. This would be a negotiation between equals, not a lecture from superior to inferior. High Chancellor Morazan had been removed from office in the aftermath of the attacks, replaced by a younger Serpentis leader named Kazrik, who understood that the old order had failed. Kazrik was barely 200 years old, considered practically a child by Serpentis standards, but his youth brought flexibility of thought that his predecessor had lacked. He sat across the negotiating table from Admiral Jacob Price and acknowledged something that the Council had refused to accept for decades. Humanity could not be controlled through traditional means. Councillor Jara retained her position despite calls for her resignation, but she rarely spoke during the negotiations. Her earlier confidence had been shattered by the attacks, replaced by a cautious wariness that made her reluctant to offer opinions. When she did speak, it was to ask questions rather than make declarations, seeking to understand rather than to judge. The transformation was remarkable to those who had known her before the war. Ambassador Velcros had been elevated to the position of chief liaison between the Council and humanity, a role that he accepted with mixed feelings. He took no satisfaction in having his warnings proven correct, no pleasure in watching the Council's authority crumble. He had genuinely believed in the principles that the Council claimed to represent: peaceful cooperation, diplomatic resolution of conflicts, the advancement of civilization through reason rather than violence. The fact that the Council had abandoned those principles when dealing with humanity was a betrayal that cut deep. The treaty that emerged from 3 months of tense negotiations established humanity as an independent power within the galactic community. Human territory was recognized and guaranteed, with strict penalties for any species that violated human borders. In exchange, Earth agreed to limit offensive military operations to cases of clear self-defense and to participate in Council deliberations on major issues affecting the galaxy as a whole. It was not perfect. Both sides had made compromises they found distasteful, but it was workable. Captain Ellen Wright, who had endured the 3-week convoy detention that exemplified Council harassment, now commanded the defensive fleet protecting the new embassy station. She stood on the observation deck during the treaty signing ceremony, watching through reinforced windows as human and alien dignitaries gathered in the main conference hall. Her feelings about the peace were complicated, mixing relief that the war had ended with anger at the necessity of it having happened at all. Commander Lisa Hayes stood beside her, equally thoughtful. She had planned many of the operations that led to human victory, had spent months calculating optimal strike patterns and coordination timings. The success of those operations had saved countless human lives by ending the war quickly, but Lisa would never forget the casualty reports that crossed her desk. the names of people who had died executing her plans. The weight of command was something that no amount of training could fully prepare someone for. On Earth, in the memorial park constructed to honor those who had fallen during the war, Admiral Jacob Price walked among black granite walls inscribed with names. Each name represented a life cut short, a family left incomplete, a future that would never be realized. Greg Sullivan walked beside him, now a general commanding the Marine Division assigned to embassy security. They moved in silence, two old soldiers who understood that victory and righteousness were not the same thing. Karen Mills attended the memorial ceremony with other survivors from Kepler 442b. Her colony had been rebuilt, stronger and better protected than before, but she would never forget watching plasma fire rain from the sky, destroying everything the colonists had spent years building. She had learned something profound during those terrible hours in the underground shelters, listening to explosions echo through the rock. Humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or tactics, but their refusal to give up, their determination to survive no matter the cost. General Victor Hayes delivered the memorial eulogy, his scarred face solemn as he spoke to the assembled crowd and the cameras broadcasting to human colonies across the galaxy. He talked about sacrifice and duty, about the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with power. He reminded everyone that the war had been won not through superior technology or numbers, but through the determination of people who refused to accept subjugation, who chose to fight even when victory seemed impossible. The galaxy was indeed changing in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The Council's absolute authority had been broken, probably forever. New alliances were forming between species that had previously been too intimidated to challenge Council supremacy. Old hierarchies were crumbling, as member species questioned whether the organization that had failed so catastrophically against humanity deserved their continued loyalty. Some species looked at humanity with fear now, seeing in them a dangerous wild card that could not be predicted or controlled. Others viewed humans with cautious respect, recognizing that they had proven themselves capable of both building peace and waging war with equal skill. A few, including surprisingly the Krellin Dominion whose raiders had attacked New Terra, sought closer relations with Earth, their merchant guilds eager to trade with a species that valued honest dealing over political manipulation. Director Claire Bennett released her comprehensive analysis of the war 6 months after the peace treaty was signed. The report became required reading at military academies across human space, studied for its insights into asymmetric warfare and the psychology of conflict. Her central conclusion was straightforward. Humanity's advantage had not been superior weapons or even tactical brilliance, but rather their willingness to adapt and think creatively when facing overwhelming odds. On Station Unity, the name given to the new embassy complex, Ambassador Velcross met regularly with Paul Grant, the human diplomat assigned as primary liaison to the Council. Paul was 47 years old with a background in xenoanthropology and genuine respect for alien cultures. Their early meetings were awkward, weighed down by the recent violence and mutual mistrust, but gradually they found ways to communicate that went beyond formal diplomatic language. They discovered shared interests in art and philosophy, spent hours discussing the different ways that various species understood concepts like justice and honor. Velcross learned that humans valued individual freedom above collective efficiency, a priority that seemed strange to his hive-oriented species, but that explained much about human behavior. Paul learned that Thaxians processed information through pheromone exchanges as much as verbal communication, a revelation that transformed his understanding of earlier diplomatic failures. Captain Henry Wade retired from active fleet command after the war, accepting a teaching position at the Terran Naval Academy on Luna. His lectures on the Battle of Station Harmony became legendary, not for celebrating the victory, but for honestly examining the mistakes made on both sides. He taught his students that war should always be the last resort, that diplomacy and patience should be exhausted before violence, but that when conflict became unavoidable, it must be fought with total commitment and clear objectives. Danny Cooper, the sheriff who had led farmers in hunting down raiders, found himself elected to the Terran Senate by the colonists of New Terra. He brought to that position a perspective shaped by life on the frontier, where policy decisions made in comfortable offices had immediate and sometimes deadly consequences for people trying to build new lives. His voice became influential in debates about colonial expansion and defense spending. Years passed and the scars of war slowly faded, though they never disappeared completely. Human colonies continued to expand. No longer hindered by council restrictions or harassment, trade flourished between species that had been enemies, creating economic interdependencies that made future conflict less likely. Children grew up in a galaxy where humanity was respected, where the name Earth carried weight in diplomatic circles, where no one questioned whether humans deserved their place among the stars. Admiral Jacob Price lived to see the establishment of the first joint human council colony, a world where different species worked together to build something new. He attended the dedication ceremony as an honored guest, now an old man with white hair and eyes that had seen too much history. Someone asked him whether the war had been worth it, whether the deaths and destruction had achieved anything meaningful. He looked at the diverse crowd gathered for the ceremony, at humans and aliens working side by side, at children of different species playing together without fear or prejudice. He thought about the warnings that the Council had ignored, about the patience that humanity had shown before finally striking back. The mining colony on Kepler 442b had been established 7 years earlier by 3,000 settlers who wanted to build something new far from Earth's crowded cities. They had transformed a barren rock into something resembling home, with pressurized domes covering small parks where children played, hydroponic gardens that supplied fresh vegetables, and a community center where families gathered after long shifts in the mines. The work was hard and dangerous, but the colonists took pride in what they had built with their own hands. Commander Greg Sullivan was responsible for colony security, which meant overseeing 12 Marines and 1 orbital defense platform that had been installed more for show than actual protection. He was 34 years old, muscular from years of military training, with a scar across his left cheek from a mining accident he had helped respond to 2 years back. He had served in the Terran Defense Fleet before retiring to this quiet posting, thinking he would spend his remaining years helping settlers rather than fighting wars. That hope died when 6 Thaxian warships appeared in orbit and broadcast their annexation decree on all frequencies. The message was simple and direct. Kepler 442b fell within territory that the Galactic Council had designated for Thaxian economic development. The human presence here was illegal under Council law. All settlers had 12 hours to evacuate the planet or face removal by force. The transmission ended with coordinates for the nearest Council refugee processing station, located 4 days away by civilian transport. Greg immediately activated the colony's emergency protocols, sending a distress signal toward Earth while ordering all civilians into the reinforced shelters deep beneath the main dome. Karen Mills, the colony administrator, joined him in the small security office that served as their command center. She was 41, a former engineer who had left Earth to escape bureaucracy and build something real. Her hands shook as she pulled up population manifests, calculating how many transport ships they would need to evacuate everyone, knowing they did not have nearly enough. The countdown timer on Greg's display showed 11 hours and 43 minutes remaining. He ran the numbers in his head, factoring in travel time and fleet response protocols. The nearest Terran defense ships were 3 days away at maximum burn. The Thaxians knew this, had obviously timed their annexation to exploit the gap in human coverage. It was legal under Council law, approved by a vote of 532 to 168, completely proper and civilized according to galactic standards. Greg stared at the timer and made a decision that he knew would probably cost him his life. He called his Marines together in the armory, 12 men and women who had signed up to protect colonists from pirates and accidents, not to fight an interstellar war. He explained the situation plainly. They could not win, could not even hope to survive, but they could buy time for the civilians to hide deeper in the mine tunnels. They could make the Thaxians pay for every meter of ground. They could send a message that would echo across the galaxy. All 12 Marines volunteered without hesitation. They spent the remaining hours converting the colony's industrial mining equipment into weapons, reprogramming the massive cutting lasers used to slice through rock, rigging mining charges as improvised explosives, setting up defensive positions in the narrow tunnels that led to the civilian shelters. Karen worked beside them, her engineering expertise invaluable as they transformed peaceful tools into instruments of war. When the countdown reached 0, Greg did not surrender. Instead, he activated every mining laser on the surface and fired at the nearest Thaxian warship. The invisible beams cut through shields that had been designed to stop plasma bolts and quantum pulses, but had no defense against simple concentrated light. Deep wounds opened in the ship's hull, venting atmosphere and bodies into space. It was not enough to destroy the vessel, but it was enough to shock the Thaxian commander into realizing that this would not be a simple occupation. The Thaxian response was devastating and immediate. Plasma lances rained down from orbit, turning the surface domes into pools of molten metal and glass. The parks where children had played vanished in white-hot fury. The community center where families had gathered became a crater. Everything the colonists had built over 7 years was erased in 7 minutes of orbital bombardment. But Greg and his Marines were already underground, moving through the mining tunnels with practiced efficiency. They had studied the tunnel layouts during the preparation time, identifying choke points and ambush positions, planning a defense that would make the Thaxians fight for every centimeter. When the alien ground forces descended in their armored landing craft, they found not frightened refugees but determined soldiers who knew the terrain and had nothing left to lose. The battle lasted 48 hours of brutal, close-quarters combat in the darkness below Kepler 442b's surface. The Thaxians had superior numbers, better armor and weapons designed for warfare. But they were not prepared for humans who used mining charges to collapse tunnels on top of advancing soldiers, who set traps using equipment the aliens did not recognize, who fought with a creativity born of desperation. Greg lost 8 of his 12 Marines in those 2 days, but the Thaxian casualties numbered in the hundreds. Meanwhile, Karen led the civilians deeper into the unexplored sections of the mine network, following geological surveys to find caverns where they could hide. 3,000 people moved through the darkness with only emergency lighting, carrying children and elderly, sharing water and food, singing softly to keep the children calm. They could hear the explosions echoing through the rock above them, feel the vibrations of plasma weapons and collapsing tunnels, and they knew that people were dying to buy them time. When the Terran Defense Fleet finally arrived, led by Captain Henry Wade aboard the battlecruiser Defiance, they found the Thaxian ships still in orbit, with landing forces scattered across the planet's surface. Henry was 47, a career naval officer who had fought pirates and smugglers but never engaged in ship-to-ship combat against a council military. He took in the tactical situation with a glance, saw the molten ruins where the colony had been, and felt something cold settle in his chest. He did not bother with warnings or negotiations. He simply ordered every weapon system on every ship in his fleet to open fire at maximum intensity. Missiles and railgun rounds filled the space around Kepler 442b, turning the orbital zone into a hell of explosions and debris. The Thaxian warships, designed for the formal battles that Council species engaged in, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer violence of human weapons. 3 ships were destroyed in the first minutes. 2 more were crippled and drifting. The last one attempted to retreat but was run down and destroyed before it could reach the faster-than-light jump point. On the surface, the Thaxian ground forces suddenly found themselves cut off from orbital support and facing human Marines who had just arrived fresh and fully armed. The fight became a massacre. Within 6 hours, the Thaxian presence on Kepler 442b had been completely eliminated. Greg emerged from the tunnels with his 4 surviving Marines, exhausted and covered in rock dust and alien blood. He found Captain Henry waiting at the entrance to the main shaft, surrounded by fresh troops who were securing the area. The 2 men looked at each other for a long moment, and no words were necessary. They both knew what this meant, what line had been crossed, what consequences would follow. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within hours of receiving reports about the battle. The chamber that had been so dismissive of Velcross's warnings was now filled with angry voices demanding action against human aggression. Councillor Jara's tank pulsed with colors indicating outrage and disbelief. High Chancellor Morazan called for immediate sanctions, for reduction of human territory, for disbanding of human military forces. The humans had violated sacred principles of proportional response, he declared, his voice shaking with fury. Ambassador Velcro sat quietly in his seat, saying nothing, his antennae moving in patterns that indicated complex emotions. He had warned them, had tried to explain what humans were capable of when pushed too far, but the Council had not wanted to listen then, and now they were learning the price of that arrogance. The Galactic Council's response to Kepler 442b came swiftly and decisively in the form of economic sanctions designed to strangle human expansion. Trade routes that human merchants had relied on were suddenly closed. Supplies of rare minerals needed for terraforming were blocked at Council checkpoints. Medical shipments bound for remote colonies were delayed for weeks at inspection stations. The message was clear. Humanity would be punished for their disproportionate response, taught through economic pressure to accept their proper place in galactic society. But the Council had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Humans had survived ice ages and plagues, had built civilizations from nothing, had overcome every obstacle their brutal homeworld had thrown at them. Economic sanctions were just another problem to solve, another challenge to overcome. Within weeks, human engineers had developed workarounds for the rare minerals. Human doctors had synthesized alternatives to blocked medicines, and human merchants had found new routes through neutral space that avoided Council territory entirely. The real damage came from the smaller provocations that followed. The 1,000 cuts designed to bleed human morale. On New Terra, a farming colony in the Tau Ceti system, raiders from the Krellin Dominion attacked outlying settlements under cover of darkness. They stole harvest equipment, burned fields ready for harvest, and killed 2 farmers who tried to defend their property. The Krellin government claimed they had no control over independent raiders, despite evidence that the attackers had used military-grade weapons and coordinated tactics. Sheriff Danny Cooper organized the response, gathering 30 volunteers from among the farmers and ranchers who made up New Terra's population. He was 53 years old, a former Marine who had retired to agricultural life but had not forgotten his training. They tracked the raiders for 3 days through wilderness that the Krellins clearly thought would provide protection. When they found the raider base hidden in a canyon network, Danny's volunteers attacked at dawn with the kind of ruthless efficiency that only farmers defending their land could muster. The Krellin, Dominion's ambassador to the Council, filed an official protest within hours, demanding reparations for the deaths of 37 Krellin citizens who had been killed in the attack. The Council reviewed the case and ordered Earth to pay compensation and surrender Sheriff Cooper for trial. Earth's response came from Admiral Jacob Price himself, delivered via hologram to the Council chamber. "Control your criminals, or we will continue to do it for you." The Council was shocked by the bluntness of this reply, by the complete lack of diplomatic courtesy or apologetic language. In the Sirius sector, a human trade convoy led by Captain Ellen Wright was stopped by a Serpentis Empire patrol for routine inspection. Ellen was 39, a veteran merchant captain who had been running cargo between human colonies for 8 years. The inspection was legal under Council trade regulations, but it dragged on for 3 weeks while the convoy's cargo of fresh food slowly spoiled in the holds. The Serpentis inspectors searched every container, questioned every crew member, and demanded documentation for items that had never required paperwork before. When the convoy was finally released, Ellen filed a formal complaint with the Council detailing the harassment and requesting compensation for the destroyed cargo. Her complaint was assigned a case number and filed away with thousands of other human grievances that the Council had no intention of addressing. Ellen returned to Earth and immediately joined the Terran Defense Fleet, bringing with her detailed knowledge of Council inspection procedures and patrol patterns that would prove invaluable in the months to come. The pattern repeated across human-controlled space. Small provocations that individually seemed minor, but collectively painted a clear picture of coordinated harassment. Council species that had never shown interest in human territory suddenly began filing territorial claims. Trade inspections that should have taken hours stretched into weeks. Human diplomats found their meeting requests delayed or ignored. It was death by 1,000 cuts, an attempt to break human will through accumulated frustration and economic damage. In the war room beneath the Swiss Alps, Admiral Jacob Price studied the holographic displays showing every human colony and every reported incident of harassment. The room was filled with senior officers who had gathered for an emergency strategic session. General Victor Hayes, commander of the Terran Marine Corps, stood at the tactical table with his arms crossed over his broad chest. At 42, he was the youngest general in the Corps history, promoted after leading successful operations against pirates in the outer colonies. His face was lined with scars from a transport crash he had survived 5 years earlier. Director Claire Bennett from Terran Intelligence delivered her assessment with the cold precision that had made her legendary in intelligence circles. She was 56, brilliant and absolutely certain of her analysis. The Council was preparing for war, she explained, though they had not formally declared their intentions. Troop movements across Council space showed clear patterns of buildup along human borders. The Thaxian Collective was constructing a new invasion fleet in their home system shipyards. The Serpentis Empire had quietly mobilized 3 additional army groups and positioned them within striking distance of human colonies. Even neutral species that had maintained friendly relations with humanity were quietly preparing their defenses, suggesting they expected major conflict to break out soon. The intelligence was solid, confirmed through multiple sources, including sympathetic aliens who disagreed with the Council's increasingly aggressive stance. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Council intended to crush humanity before humans could become strong enough to challenge galactic order. Jacob listened to the briefing in silence, his weathered face showing no emotion as Claire laid out the evidence. He had spent the last 6 months hoping that reason would prevail, that the Council would eventually recognize humanity as equals and accept peaceful coexistence. That hope had been naive, he now realized. The Council had maintained power for 12,000 years by ensuring that no single species could challenge their authority. Humanity's rapid expansion and military capability represented exactly the kind of threat that the Council could not tolerate. Commander Lisa Hayes proposed an alternative to waiting for the Council's inevitable attack. Instead of allowing them to coordinate their forces and strike at a time of their choosing, humanity should launch a preemptive operation. Hit their supply lines before they could be used to support invasion fleets, disrupt their communications networks, strike at their command centers, force the Council to fight defensively on human terms, before they could bring their overwhelming numerical advantage to bear. It was aggressive, risky, and completely contrary to everything humanity had claimed to stand for during their 3 decades in the galactic community. It would make Earth look like the aggressor in the eyes of neutral species. It would confirm every prejudice that the Council held about human violence and primitiveness. But it would also give humanity the best chance of survival against an enemy with vastly superior resources. The debate in the room lasted for 2 hours, with officers arguing both sides passionately. General Victor made the point that Marines were trained to take the fight to the enemy, that defensive warfare on human colonies would result in massive civilian casualties. Director Claire noted that intelligence assets positioned throughout Council space would be compromised once hostilities began, so any covert operations needed to happen immediately while those assets were still functional. Captain Henry Wade, attending via hologram from his ship in orbit around Earth, argued for caution, noting that an unprovoked attack would destroy any chance of diplomatic resolution. But even he admitted that the intelligence suggested diplomacy was already dead, killed by Council arrogance and fear of human potential. Admiral Jacob finally called for a vote among his senior staff. The result was 14 in favor of preemptive action, 3 opposed and 2 abstaining. It was not the unanimous support he had hoped for, but it was enough. He drafted a proposal for the Terran Senate outlining Operation Sunfall, a coordinated strike against Council military infrastructure designed to cripple their ability to wage offensive war against humanity. The Senate debate lasted 3 hours and was fierce. Some senators argued that attacking first made humanity no better than the species they claimed to be defending against. Others pointed out that waiting for the Council to strike first would mean fighting battles on human soil, with human civilian casualties. The vote came down to a narrow margin, 127 in favor, 98 opposed, barely meeting the 2/3 majority required for military action. Operation Sunfall was authorized to commence in 72 hours.